There's probably going to be some spoilers in this video for certain Final Fantasy games, so if you don't want to be spoiled, make sure you finish the relevant game and then come back and watch the rest of the video. You've been warned. Man, if ever I was going to make a list video featuring unpopular opinions, this is it. Will it be Chocobo or Chocano? This is my top 5 favourite Final Fantasy games. Let's do this! Number 5. Final Fantasy X-2. I once heard this game be described as a dress-up simulator, and honestly, that's not entirely inaccurate. The 3 main characters, all women— oh my god, female protagonists in my video games? Social justice warrior cuck libtards turning the frogs gay! Change between classes or roles by changing their outfits, or dress spheres as they're called in-game. The variety of tactics and playstyles supported by the system is pretty robust, since there's 20 different dress spheres to unlock and level up. It's a strange twist on the standard job system seen in other Final Fantasy games, and honestly I found the experimenting with different dress spheres and accessories to be enjoyable. Do I look fabulous, Alex? Why, yes you do, Alex. You look radiant and splendid. Why, just the— shit. As Final Fantasy games go, this one's pretty short, but it does offer a New Game Plus feature, so you can play again and keep all your gear and maybe go a different route, since this game is non-linear pretty much from the start. With this being the first ever Final Fantasy game to be a direct sequel, it follows some of the characters from Final Fantasy X in the same vibrant and interesting world. I think the story does a good job of keeping you guessing as to what's going on without making you feel like you have no idea what's going on. Final Fantasy X-2 proved that Square could indeed make direct sequels to Final Fantasy games and have them turn out to be really good. Not bad for a dress-up simulator. No, you don't understand, it triples my AP! Number 4. Final Fantasy 15. After 10 years of slowly forgetting that Final Fantasy Versus 13 was going to be a thing, Square finally released it, now renamed Final Fantasy 15. Overall, I thought the story in this one took a major backseat compared to most Final Fantasy games, where the story is usually the main focus. I found myself repeatedly wondering who certain characters were or why I should be interested, and Square's choice to try to pass off the world's most obvious villain as something other than a villain really stuck out as odd.
I'm an impatient traveller, ready to turn ship.
He did it.
The ceasefire's getting us nowhere.
Nothing's happened yet, but when it does, he fucking did it. But for me, where the game really excelled was its portrayal of the relationship between the 4 main characters. The game is essentially one giant road trip, and I felt the journey was far more interesting and important than the destination. The bromance the main characters share comes across as genuine, and just talking about it here is making me want to hang out with the boys once more, driving the regalia, going on hunts, and of course, trying out new recipes! Ah, good times. Not a perfect game, and not really your traditional Final Fantasy, but there's a certain charm to it that makes me look back on it fondly. It's such a shame that since release they've been milking this game for all it's worth, releasing story episode after story episode that basically fill in a lot of the missing story and character development that should have been in the game from day one. Then there's the fact they released an animated film just before the game that wasn't free, which basically sets up the world and contains a shit ton of story that again should have been in the game from day one. Are you starting to see why I think the story took a backseat in Final Fantasy 15? Despite the underwhelming story, I have to say I greatly enjoyed my time with it, and I will definitely be playing through it again at some point. Number 3. Final Fantasy 13. Whoa, 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 whoa! Don't unsubscribe just yet, you bastards. Hear me out. Yes, the game is linear AF, but it's not the first Final Fantasy game to be so. Yes, I know fans wanted more shops and cities full of NPCs to chat to, but the story kind of makes that impossible. And yes, the combat for the vast majority of the game is pretty much just press X until win, but honestly that could describe most Final Fantasy games. There, I just addressed the 3 main gripes people tend to have with this game. That was unbelievably easy. Now on to the good stuff. I actually enjoyed the combat in Final Fantasy 13, and in tough fights it could be a thrill furiously trying to change to your defensive paradigm as the enemy is about to hit you with their main attack, or spamming your buff-debuff paradigm at enemies to severely cripple them before unleashing hell and breaking them, opening up your opportunities to do major damage. The main reason I love Final Fantasy 13 so much is the story. God damn, that story was good. At the time, this was the best looking Final Fantasy game by a large margin, and the beautiful graphics along with the Metal Gear Solid length cutscenes really helped suck me into the world. During the story, your party are literally branded outcasts and can't risk going into populated areas, hence the lack of NPCs people complained about. The characters are stuck between fulfilling a prophecy in which the world is destroyed and ignoring their destiny, which would lead them to spending the rest of eternity as horrifying monsters stuck in a perpetual living hell of regret and torment. Truly a fate worse than death. It's like if you took the all is lost moment and made a whole game out of it. All the way through the game, I was wondering how they were going to get out of this situation. There never seemed like there was going to possibly be a happy resolution, right up until what might be the best ending to a game I've ever seen, where they both save the world and destroy it. I remember audibly saying, wow, during the final cutscene. Not many games have done that. In terms of satisfying conclusions to a story I was heavily invested in, this one is right up there with Metal Gear Solid 4. Then they shat out 2 abortions of sequels that nobody asked for, but most people hated. I couldn't even bring myself to finish Final Fantasy 13-2. Shame. Number 2. Final Fantasy 8. Final Fantasy 7 was the first Final Fantasy game I ever played. In fact, it was the first turn-based RPG I ever played. I grew up with a Mega Drive, you see, and unlike the SNES, it wasn't known for its RPGs. Anyway, I played Final Fantasy 7 and loved it, but never got around to buying it for some reason. When Final Fantasy 8 released 2 years later, I was all over that shit from day one. As the very first Final Fantasy game I went balls deep into, you can imagine I have a soft spot for it. Oh, were you expecting me to be balls deep in something? Grow up. The story was on a scale I'd not yet seen in a video game. Hell, the game itself was the biggest game I'd played at the time, spanning 4 discs. 4! I fell in love with the turn-based combat, and personally I think the magic system where you have a certain amount of each spell is better than the system of having a pool of MP. That's just my preference. Being able to junction magic to your character's stats really helped add depth and customization to your character's development. Summoning the many Guardian Forces was always awesome, and it was cool to hammer square to increase the power of the attack instead of just having to watch the animation play while sitting idly by. I liked the idea of your main character being able to manually trigger critical hits by pressing R1 at the right time during an attack. I liked the way Garden, your base of operations, contained its own training section where you could fight a T-Rexor for some nice XP boosts.
Have at thee, T-Rexor!
I liked the way you earned a wage based on your distance travel instead of just finding money after killing monsters. I liked the idea of having to take exams to increase your rank and therefore your pay. And I love the monster card minigame, Triple Triad. This is my favourite minigame in all of Final Fantasy. Many NPCs throughout the game would be up for playing some Triple Triad, and as you build your deck with more powerful cards, you can challenge people who have super rare cards that feature characters from the game. It was always awesome to stop the fighting for a bit and play some cards. And that music. Oh, the memories. I really wish Square would pull their finger out and port the game to iOS already. I mean, they've ported Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9, but no 8 for some reason. Why you hate me, Square? Why you hate me? And my number one favourite Final Fantasy game of all time is Final Fantasy X. This isn't just my favourite Final Fantasy game of all time, it was my favourite game for 9 years. It would have made it a decade at the top, but a little game called Skyrim came out, which I bought 5 times, no big deal. Final Fantasy X was the first Final Fantasy game to feature voice acting, which was a huge deal at the time because all previous games involved a huge amount of reading and imagining characters' voices. Having a game this large be fully voice acted was outright impressive. It was also the first Final Fantasy game on the PS2. Gone were the static, pre-rendered backgrounds of the PS1 Final Fantasy games. Here we had fully realised 3D environments, and as a result, the world felt much more real. The combat in Final Fantasy X is, in my opinion, the pinnacle of the series, which is a good thing when something like 70% of your time with the game would be spent in combat. It was truly turn-based combat this time. Instead of having to wait for time bars to fill up like in previous games, the characters and enemies would take turns in a specific order depending on the stats of all those involved. The order of turns was displayed on the right side of the screen, so you could often plan your moves many turns in advance. This greatly increased the tactical nature of the combat in Final Fantasy and removed any pressure or need to rush. You could take as long as you wanted planning a strategy. For some reason they went back to having time bars in Final Fantasy X-2 and the subsequent installments, but for one game we had the perfect system and it was awesome. Final Fantasy X contains my second favourite minigame in the series, Blitzball. Look, I can totally see why some people don't like it. It's incredibly involved and so deep they could honestly have just sold it as a game in its own right. You could hire new players you find out in the world and even level them up and learn new techniques. Square really went whole hog with this minigame and I loved them for it. I spent orders of magnitude more time playing Blitzball than I did playing Final Fantasy XIII-2, I can tell you that much. The summons in this game were vastly improved over previous games as well. Instead of just summoning them and watching them do their one attack and then leave, in this game you summon them and then control them as if they were a character. You could attack, use magic, even heal your summon, as well as being able to teach them more abilities as you progress through the game. Of course the summons still had their main devastating attacks, which all looked awesome. Just a huge improvement all round. In fact, that's how I describe the game. Final Fantasy X is just a huge improvement all round over the previous games and set a standard that Square, in my opinion, simply hasn't been able to get close to since. And that's why it's my favourite Final Fantasy game of all time. Before I go, I think I should address why some fan favourites didn't make the list. Final Fantasy VII. I've started playing Final Fantasy VII something like 6 times now, and I've never been able to stay interested in it long enough to get off disc 1. I like it and everything, but for whatever reason I just get bored fairly early on. I've recently started it again on my phone, and here's hoping I can stick with it long enough to really see why it's considered the best in the series by many. Side bonus note, I've since finished Final Fantasy VII on my phone. It's really good, the story is crazy, I can see why for many people it's their favourite. I would say it's 6th for me, my 6th favourite Final Fantasy game. No doubt if I had played it to completion 21 years ago when it came out, I would probably think better of it. It's still a very good game. I'm actually playing through it a second time. I've started a second playthrough already, so there's that. Final Fantasy IX. I hear people love this one. I did not. Again, it simply couldn't keep my interest for very long. I didn't care for the dumb character designs with seemingly no consistent tone, I didn't care for the world I found myself in, and I really hated the minigame, which was basically a bastardized triple triad from Final Fantasy VIII, except as far as I was able to tell, they took all the skill out and replaced it with luck. Fuck Tetramaster, triple triad for life. And Final Fantasy VI. I went back and played this for the first time a few years ago, but just as with Chrono Trigger, I've realised I simply can't get into 2D RPGs I wasn't into back in the day, for some reason. Note that I'm not saying these 3 games are bad, not even close. I'm just saying that I couldn't get into them. And that's it. That's my top 5 favourite Final Fantasy games of all time. You can leave a comment to tell me exactly how wrong all of my choices are, except for 10, because I know everyone acknowledges 10 as awesome. But I'm sure I'll be mocked for 15 and 13, but I don't give a fuck. I'm basing this list on how much I enjoyed each game, and this is the result, so there's that. Let me know what you think the best is. I want to see how many of you put 7, because I keep saying that 7's widely regarded as the best by fans. But, I don't know, it might be 6. Either way, I'm done. Peace.